Welcome. I'm Sam Nabby, an organizer with Hold the Line Waterloo Region, and I'm here to ask questions to candidates in the 2022 Ontario provincial election on behalf of a collective of local environmental organizations. I'm here today with Wayne Mock, candidate for the Green Party in Kitchener Centre. Wayne, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
All 8 municipal governments have committed to transform WR, the strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050, with a 50% reduction by 2030. How will you, as a local representative, help our communities and businesses achieve this goal?
By trying to electrify everything. So like locally, the short answer is grants and incentives for small and medium businesses to help with that transition to electrify everything. And a lot of that comes from just redirecting funding away from sprawl like infrastructure, like the proposed Highway 413, and investing in infrastructure that encourages reductions in emissions, better transit options to connect our communities, for example, or build incentives for heat pumps in buildings, because I believe buildings and transportation are a huge chunk of our region's emissions. And we got some great local technology here too. There's an outfit in Cambridge that can bring heat pumps to work right down to -50. So creating and incentivizing these great local jobs is a little bit of what I can do as the local representative here to help transform WR's strategy.
Thank you. Next question. How will your party commit to meeting the target of protecting 30% of Ontario's lands and waters by 2030, in keeping with Canada's international commitments?
Well, we like the target. It's Green Party. So part of it is recognizing and supporting Indigenous protected and conserved areas. So funding Indigenous stewardship, essentially, and putting priority for protecting biodiversity hotspots, like, for example, peatlands that holds a lot of the carbon without exemptions for forestry and mining. Try to limit down those loopholes. And you may have heard of our proposal for a blue belt. It's essentially an expanded green belt, but aimed at protecting the farmlands and marshes and waterways. And this includes the Nith and Grand River watersheds in our region, because marshes filter our water, protects us against flooding. Flooded basements are expensive, so there's other incentives too, but these are just part of the strategies we want to put into protecting this target of lands and water.
Mm-hmm. The Periscope moraine has been excluded from the current government's Greenbelt expansion plans. Would you include it? And could you speak a bit more to that?
Absolutely. In fact, Mike Schreiner, the leader of the Green Party, has talked a lot about putting that moraine under this proposed blue belt. So yes, unequivocally.
Okay. Great. We'll move on to the next question then. Amid a booming housing market, how will you ensure that we have an adequate supply of mixed, multi-use housing and complete walkable communities so that new home construction is done sustainably and affordably?
For me personally, I think we just got to bring back nonprofit development. A lot of our affordable housing supply was built in the 70s to 90s and just stopped once it stopped being mindfully funded. Part of it's also allowing zoning to allow for diversity of housing options. Currently, it's really tall or it's sprawled out into our farmland. It's a bit extreme. There's a middle, and allowing zoning to allow for that is a big step in the right direction. We just, for me, I want to promote communities again. I'm thinking of the future and how do we get to that future? What policies do we need to get to a future we want? And I can see how we plan communities to be where everything you need is within 15 minutes of your home. I know the building minimum standards are being reviewed soon at the end of the year. So I would love to advocate for sustainable policies there, like a net zero standard, for example. Those are some ways I'm thinking about it as a local representative here. And I'm trying to reach that goal of building communities again.
You mentioned a net zero standard. Adding standards like that, it could increase the cost of building and discourage new supply. How do you balance those priorities?
Well, I view it's actually building buildings to be sustainable, quick and dirty builds, may be cheap in the initial cost, but may have long-term operating costs that are quite heavy. So if we build it right in those minimum standards the first time, that would bring down the costs over time, that you don't have to basically patch over cracks. You've got a good foundation in that sense. That's how I'd see it.
Okay. Next question. How will you support sustainable transportation choices with less car dependency and better active transportation and public transit?
No more sprawl highways. Yeah, no more 50 cell sprawl. So 413 is one I've already brought up. We'd like to upload a lot of the active and public transportation costs up into the provincial side and have the province directly fund and work with regions to improve services. And this is both active and public transit parts. With Vision Zero in mind. So that includes replacing funds for having fares. We'd like to have the fare transportation, but we need to replace it and invest even more so that the service levels make it a viable alternative. And that's part of my part earlier of trying to build communities that are connected. If they're well connected, we can bring back communities. And the goal, the green goal is to triple public transportation usage by 2030, which is quite ambitious. And you really can only do that with improved service, not just inducing demand by having fares.
One of the transit investments in this region that has been a focus of both the Kathleen Wynne government and the Doug Ford government has been two-way all-day GO train service to Kitchener. Neither of those governments have made it happen. And what would you do differently to get that two-way all-day GO train between Kitchener and Toronto?
I know there are a lot of technical reasons, but like building bypasses at certain stations and the purchasing of rail lines along the way, just working closely with Metrolinx to make that a priority for our region. It's a simple, it sounds simple. It's definitely a lot more complicated underneath the covers.
I want to stay on this question for a little bit longer. You mentioned electrification and increased transit investment. Some of Ontario's nuclear plants are approaching the end of their lifespan. With the increased electricity demand, how do we make sure we're not falling back on fossil fuels to generate that electricity?
Yeah, like if we're going to really expand our electricity, we need to make sure we have a source for that. We are very lucky to have a neighbor that produces very affordable, low carbon electricity, and that's had trouble selling it to other jurisdictions. So in my mind, being able to improve our electrical grid infrastructure to make it easier to buy from Quebec, and in very small cases for Northern Ontario, from Manitoba as well, being able to access other jurisdictions that produce a lot of low carbon electricity is a great way while we try to develop the expansion of our electrical grid.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question then. How will your party protect farmland and address the negative ecological effects of aggregate extraction?
Aggregate, fun topic. For the farmland part, we're proposing to currently freeze urban boundaries and put a moratorium on all new gravel mining approvals and expansion, because we still need gravel to build railways, but there's already 5,000 approved gravel mining sites that are licensed, and that's enough to extract 13 times the provincial's annual use of aggregate. I'm not an expert in aggregate, but I'm under the understanding that there's a lot of leftover from existing projects that don't get recycled. They're just kind of tossed. So some sort of system to reuse the aggregate that's already around. This is some of the ways that I can see protecting farmlands and mitigating the effects of aggregate extraction. Also working more closely with conservation authorities who have much more of a hand on this topic than I do.
Wonderful. Final question here. What are you prepared to do to help ensure that Indigenous people, women, people of color, and other marginalized groups that are often most disproportionately affected are prioritized in the needed solutions to our environmental crisis?
Yeah, so the concept of environmental racism, a lot of things I thought of off the top of my head was very much Indigenous focused. So for our Indigenous communities, I talked a little bit in the past about funding their stewardship of the land and water, but also just bring them into the process. So work with them to site essential electricity transmission lines, like we're talking about energy earlier, bringing back Indigenous planned forest burns, and also just like clean up the mercury that's poisoning Gassy Narrows, like parts like that. Overall, we need to bring back communities. I've talked about a lot, feels like a broken record, but for a lot of marginalized groups, there's no safe third place to gather. So bringing increased green spaces is a great start. And I want a future where we're a lot more collaborative, where we all talk to each other. So building our society and like just the city itself with that in mind, where everyone can be included, is a great way to, I guess, further these, diversity, equity, inclusion, advocacy parts.
Mhm. So Kitchener Center is located on the Haldeman Tract. Six Nations elected council and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy chiefs have announced a moratorium on development 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. How do you respond to their demands, and how would you work with them as an MPP?
Well, like first off, they need to be included in the conversation. Like they just haven't been for so long. So we, as an MPP, they're probably one of the first people you reach out to, and seeing like what are their concerns and how the development has worked along the Haldeman track. And it's hard to hypothesize like where that conversation would go, but they would be one of the first people included in those conversations from like the provincial level. If we were making large sweeping changes, which you want to work with the existing regions and municipalities as a MPP, but these councils would be part of that conversation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your time, Wayne. I think we'll leave it there. Is there any final words that you'd like to say?
Well, thanks for inviting me, and I want everyone to kind of think of like every vote you have is a possible future. So think of the future one and the policies we need to get there. I'm hoping to have an optimistic view of in Ontario that we want, that is more collaborative, caring, sustainable. Like let's hope to have some optimism a bit of what our choices could be.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.